Ace Attorney is a visual novel series in which you play as a defense attorney. The core of the gameplay involves defending your client in court by listening to witness testimony, pressing them for details, and pointing out contradictions when you spot them. With each contradiction spotted, the story progresses. Witnesses amend their statements, they change their story, and they get replaced with other witnesses, and the details of the case become more and more clear. What makes all this so good is how incredibly over-the-top and stylish everything is. A lot of the quality of the story is carried by the oozing personality of the characters. Getting the killers to finally take the stand acts as a kind of boss fight. The music radically shifts when you finally crack through their defenses and pursue them. They go from arrogant to desperate, their lies beget more lies until you finally shut down any avenue of escape. It's fucking spectacular. The sound design, the intricate cases, the iconic characters. The games are a marvel, and they really innovated this field of mystery game. But they do have a few problems. One in particular keeps getting worse every time they release a new title. The issue is that the series has too much accumulated history. There are too many characters, and each character's backstory has become bloated and complex. But they keep adding new characters in, or tacking on more history to characters that were already established. There's just too much there. So much so that even the writers don't want to deal with it, and it gets largely ignored. By the end of the first game, Phoenix has already dealt with the demon prosecutor, the CEO of an information company that was blackmailing the prosecutor's office, the chief of fucking police, and the god of prosecution himself, with an unblemished 40-year win streak. And that's just in the first game. How am I supposed to see anybody as a threat after that? But even in the latest games, where he has even more history, he's not written like a middle-aged defense attorney with over a decade of experience. He still acts and is treated like the rookie he was in his very first trial. In Apollo Justice, Phoenix is like a different person. He's cryptic, analytical, and calculating. He plans like a year ahead in advance. It was the most interesting change to a character I've seen in a while. You can't just undo all that, but that's exactly what they did. Then there's the big deal they made about the jurist system that they never mentioned again. There's the dark age of the law, and then there's what they did to poor Apollo. He really got the worst of it. I'm actually an Apollo Justice apologizer. I don't think his backstory is bad exactly, it just clearly wasn't planned. Apollo's backstory is whatever the story needs it to be at the time, and it results in a situation where yes, he's the lost son of famous magicians, but was raised in a foreign country by an insurrectionist revolutionary leader before being sent back to his home country by himself at the age of 9, where he grew up with astronauts, not knowing that his mom was a world-famous singer with magical powers. This is what happens when a continuity lasts too long. Accumulated history is like the anomalies that build up in a cell's DNA as it replicates. The formula itself is partially to blame for this sorry state. The original Phoenix Wright game was already close to perfect in terms of how the experience was structured. A murder happens, then you go through an investigation phase, and then finally the courtroom phase. There wasn't much anybody could do to improve on this design. The most we've ever gotten in terms of innovation is being able to inspect evidence in 3D, and sometimes the court will have us go through 2 witnesses instead of 1 before we get to the killer. There's also stuff like the mood matrix and the divine seance, but those things don't really represent progress because it's not like it's the kind of thing that could become a mainstay in the series. Now, I still think that the modern Ace Attorneys are okay, but they're increasingly bloated and stale. The only way they can add more to the story is to either make new characters or add more to existing ones, which would simply aggravate the problem of accumulated history. The following is a quote from Shu Takumi, the director of the first 3 Ace Attorney games. I felt that Phoenix's story had been told and that the series should not continue. Knowing when to end a story is very important, and I wanted to avoid dragging it out and having it become a shadow of its former self. End quote. Mr. Takumi wanted to end the series after the trilogy to avoid specifically the problem I've outlined. Apollo Justice was his attempt to tell a mostly new story unrelated to Phoenix. Unfortunately, Takumi was not involved with the development of Ace Attorney 5 and Ace Attorney 6, so Phoenix was unceremoniously dragged back into the spotlight. This decision has put the series in a weird position where they can't let their characters go, but they also can't let them change in meaningful ways. I had mostly resigned myself to accepting that Ace Attorney would die a slow death after Capcom had squeezed every cent they could after the characters in the franchise. But then we got the Great Ace Attorney. Once again directed by Shu Takumi, the Great Ace Attorney throws all that history out and starts over. It fixes every problem I've so far listed. Gone is the accumulated history, replaced by a freshness and newness that I've not felt since the original trilogy. And it's not just about solving existing problems, the game improves in ways I didn't even realize I wanted. Every single thing it does fantastically. The characters, the music, the dialogue, the atmosphere, the style of it all. I've spent half the game kind of just shocked at how good it is. I can't believe that this is the same series I started on the DS all those years ago, and whose structure I thought couldn't really be improved. Normally, I try and avoid overview-style reviews where you just go through a checklist of graphics, story, gameplay, and such. But the Great Ace Attorney does so many things so well that any attempt to mention all of them would just naturally result in me mentioning every aspect of the game. So I kinda don't have a choice. I have very little to complain about. So with that in mind, let's give all those aspects a proper look. I never thought I'd say this about an Ace Attorney game, but its 3D graphics are phenomenal. Especially if you compare it to the game's original release on the 3DS, or any of the 3D Ace Attorneys. I've always liked the 2D animations more. I thought they looked nicer and made the characters more expressive. But I realize now that my dislike for 3D models was due to the limitations of the hardware. Ace Attorney has never looked this good. And the upgrade in hardware has done so much more than you'd expect it to. The whole point of having characters being so over the top is to help accentuate the atmosphere, like when you're entering a decisive moment or you've just made a big revelation. The 3D models help a lot with that. Thanks to the camera being able to move, the finger pointing has never been so dramatic, and even the witness and prosecutor animations are more lively and complex. It's also allowed for the use of interesting innovations to gameplay. Investigations now have a deduction section where you help Herlock Sholmes make deductions by guiding his observations. These sections are obscenely stylish, and you can tell whoever worked on them had a lot of fun making them. They're a good addition to the otherwise simple investigation process, of just talking to people and collecting evidence. There's also the Summation Examinations during the court. In these sections you change the jury's mind not by presenting evidence, but by using their own reasoning to pit them against other jurors. Once again, I need to highlight how stylish it is. It doesn't last too long and it's not as dramatic, but watching Ryunosuke pacing back and forth on the witness stand and explaining his reasoning is seriously cool. Finally, there's one more gameplay addition that's far more impactful than it seems. There can now be multiple witnesses on the stand, and when you press them for details, you can ask other witnesses for their thoughts. But the pressing isn't actually the important point here, it's that there's so many witnesses that can testify at once. You see, because of how witness testimony was structured in previous games, you could only have one witness at a time. And since you don't want cases to take forever, that means you can only have one or two witnesses testify before you get to the real killer. This limits what you can do with the events in a case's scenario, since you have all these constraints. But now not only do developers have more options of what can happen in court, they also can make cases have more twists, since 3 or 4 people can take the stand at the same time. All of this is real innovation, not some gimmick like the Mood Matrix. Each one of these elements could be adapted, improved upon, or reimagined in any of the new games they decided to make. It proves that Capcom still has untapped creativity to bring to this series, and I couldn't be happier to see it. Now, as for the characters, they're all excellent. They are every bit as likable and iconic as anything in the original trilogy. If anything, they're even better written and less one-dimensional. Ace Attorney is known for being somewhat silly, but it can still be serious when it wants to be. There were some genuinely emotional moments even for non-major characters. And these moments are not all super dramatic either. Sometimes they're quite subdued. The writers have definitely gotten better at setting the right tone at the right time. I won't spoil much here, but there were several times where minor witness characters elicited a decently emotional response from me as they explained their motivations. I want to talk about Susato a bit. Susato is your judicial assistant. She's this series' version of Maya. But the thing with Susato is that, unlike Maya, she's extremely competent. She's not just cute comedic relief. She has a personality that's not based around being likable and silly. And she's rather reserved and polite. In fact, kind of like a real person, you don't get a sense of her personality until you've spent a lot of time with her. I think she's a really well done character. Oh, and then there's Barak von Zykes. Holy shit, this guy was cool. He is now my absolute favorite prosecutor, which is a real accomplishment really because the competition in that department is stiff. There are 3 things about him that I think really put him ahead of the pack, though. I like his animations. In fact, I like them quite a lot. I like the way he talks, how he strings sentences together. But most importantly, I like him because I think he's the smartest prosecutor in the series. You see, all the prosecutors have a certain gravitas, amplified by their in-game reputations. They're all supposed to be super genius prodigies that became attorneys at the age of 13. But their reputation is often belied in the court when they don't see something obvious or are caught by surprise by something they shouldn't be. Now yes, this is a video game, so that kind of thing is often unavoidable. But with Prosecutor Von Zykes, this happens a lot less often. For most cases, especially early on, he spends most of the time fully in control of the situation. Anytime you think you've made a big reversal with a summary examination, he blasts really obvious holes in your argument. And when he does make mistakes or is surprised, it's usually by things that he couldn't have reasonably known. It's not always the case, but for the most part he's simply less stupid, and it makes it easier for me to be immersed in what's going on. And that's a trend that's emblematic of a lot of these characters. Von Zykes is the most obvious, but Tobias Gregson is also quite competent for an Ace Attorney standards. So are many of the villains. The more I can suspend my disbelief undisturbed, the better. Now for the chapters and the cases. The cases in the game are interesting for a few reasons. Because it's Victorian-era London, there's no fingerprint or DNA testing, which is kind of great because now the scenario writers don't have to work around it so much. The cases are also much longer. The tutorial case in particular, in the first game, feels more like a final boss case, and the case at the end of the second game is distributed into 2 chapters, with the last chapter being entirely a trial. These chapters are meaty. Maybe even a little too meaty. My total game time for both games was like 50 hours, and I don't feel like I was going particularly fast or slow. There were moments when the cases felt like they dragged on too long, but I think this is a result of having both games at the same time. You see, the second game is a direct sequel to the first, and it's identical in tone, atmosphere, location, and theme, and its story really is just a continuation of the first one. So they don't really feel like separate games, especially if you play them back to back. But by the time I got to the second case of the second game, I was already getting burnt out by the length. However, I'm not sure this was a problem for people in the original release. The games were originally released 2 years apart, and tell one cohesive narrative, so their length, I think, is only really a problem if you binged it, like I did. So, let me get to my conclusion. The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles is everything an Ace Attorney game should be. I have very few complaints. The only things that come to mind are that occasionally the case length is too much, and the ending of the first game was slightly less satisfying than I might have hoped. But overall, I thought the game was beyond excellent, far exceeding what I thought Ace Attorney was capable of providing these days. And more importantly, it gives me hope for the future of the franchise. It makes me think Capcom has realized that this is the direction Ace Attorney really needs to go. The series has been in a precarious financial position for a long time, but with the director of Ace Attorney 5 and 6 now gone from the company, and Chronicles releasing internationally, I think there's a good chance Shu Takumi will be put in charge of the franchise's future direction. And that, I think, would be a great idea. Great Ace Attorney was also directed by him, and it's recaptured my interest in this series in a very big way.